So I want to discuss with you a book that I have written, and a book published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing, and that is Are We All Cousins? And how history and genetics define Jewish identity and Jewish diversity that we have in the world. So looking at this very first slide, we know that for millennia now, Jews were living all over the world. It was a part of our existence in diaspora. And we kind of called each other by those names of places where we lived, like the Moroccan Jews, Georgian Jews, Ethiopian Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews. But the questions that sort of on everybody's mind, always been, at least on mine, are all these Jewish groups related to one another genetically or not? And the second question is, are all these Jewish groups also related to ancient Hebrews to justify our sort of connection with the Holy Land and the previous ancestry and generations? So how do we find out? And so in order to do that, I will go fairly quickly over the history of diaspora, and that will include history and their legends of different Jewish groups. And then I will remind you, because I know most of you do know some genetic terms, but if you've forgotten, so it will be kind of very quick reminder, refresher of genetic concepts, how to prove ancestry or relationship. And then when we're done with this, we'll try to weave it together, the historical events of diaspora with whatever we know about genetics, and see whether or not indeed all these Jewish groups are related to one another. So to begin with, Jewish history basically starts with Abraham leaving Ur and then accepting the existence of monotheistic God, one God for him, for his descendants, for everybody else. And God, in response, offered him and promised him to resettle Jews in Canaan at this point. So he migrated from living a large part of his family, taking smaller part with him, to Canaan. And just skipping through very quickly, he had the son Isaac, whom he almost sacrificed to show his covenant with God, and God stopped him. And by the way, that's what stopped all the human sacrifices in ancient Hebrews at that time. And then he had a grandson, Jacob, who has two main sort of historical purposes, if you will. One, that Jacob was called Israel, and from which we all inherited that name, and he was called Israel because he wrestled with God, and that was his name that he accepted at that time. And the second, his major contribution to all of us, is that he had 12 sons, although it's with 4 women, but who counts at that time? He had 12 sons who actually created those 12 tribes of Israel. And then went first to Egypt, and when they returned from Egypt, when Moses led them back to the Promised Land, they settled in the Promised Land. And you can see here the 12 tribes. Why is it a kind of 12? Because two of his sons did not get tribal land. Joseph did not get tribal land, but instead Manasseh and Ephraim got the land. So 12 minus 1 is 11, plus 2 is 13. And how is it back to 12? Because Levites did not get tribal land either. They were living among all the other tribes, performing their priestly function at that time. So those tribes, and as maybe of today, the Jewish tribes don't live peacefully among each other. They always have something to argue about, but they also had arguments with the neighbors, surrounding neighbors. And when they had to defend themselves against those neighbors, they had to combine their forces into one. And that's what the start period of Judges, when they have selected one judge who would be military sort of leader for all those tribes to defend themselves against aggression from other tribes. And there were 14 judges, 13 men, and one woman was the most important military person. But then they eventually understood that even selecting one person during military and needs and time is probably not good enough for governing large nation. So they asked Samuel, which was the last judge at that time, to present them with the king, or person who would be governing the entire 12 tribes, one Israel, one kingdom of Israel. And he selected King Saul, who was the first king of combined nation. Here he is. He was a great military leader. He fell in one of the battles. And after he fell, a new king comes in, and that is King David. And King David was very good military leader for Israelites. They kept their kingdom together. But according to biblical texts, God didn't allow him to build the temple because he was too much into military. He was too much of a warrior. So he said that function will be given to your son. And indeed, when David died, then comes King Solomon, one of his sons, becomes the king, and that's the real apogee, I would guess, the highest point of combined of Israeli kingdom at that time. There were a lot of merchant connections with other nations. He was very wise, very great, both economically and politically and societally. Had one negative point from a point of view of God, and that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and it was a little bit too much for God at that time. He said, when after your death, because of this, the kingdom will be separated into two. It will not stay as one kingdom. Again, not my words, biblical. And that indeed what happened. After Solomon's death, there was a separation into Israel, northern kingdom, and Judah with Jerusalem, a southern kingdom at that time. They were fighting among themselves. Again, that's not without this, but they also were fighting all other nations around. And one of the biggest nations that came in was Assyrian Empire that rose a little bit farther east from Israel and Judah, and they took over, and they actually completely defeated the state of Israel. Only state of Judah remained here in the green, but the other ones were taken over by Assyrians. And here comes kind of interesting element, one of the very first ethnic cleansing, so to speak. When what Assyrian did, they may not have been the first, but it's one of the first described in the historical literature. They picked up people from settlements and took them way deep into Assyrian territory. And instead, they brought some Assyrians or other nations to settle where this conquered people were. The reasoning was to prevent large riots, so disperse people around the empire. That's how they did it. And so that was an initial wave of Jewish diaspora when Jews were taken away by Assyrian, moved eastwards, somewhat north and east. But then comes another empire after Assyrians, and that's Babylonians. They defeat Assyrians, create Neo-Babylonian Empire, and they destroy that first temple that Solomon built. So that's the end of the first temple period. What they also did, they followed what Assyrians' method was of resettlement, and now they took everybody from the north of Israel, from Judah, from the south, and everyone went into Babylonian exile. So as many people they could put back, that's what they did. Again, a couple hundred years passed by, and then new empire comes in, and that's Persian Empire, and the emperor Cyrus the First, or Cyrus the Great, was the great liberator of all the Jews, and he not only he allowed all kind of religions to flourish within Persian Empire, because Persians obviously were not Muslims at that time. They were Zoroastrians before. So he allowed all religions to flourish, and he allowed Jews to come back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. In fact, his son Darius the First gave huge amount of money and power and whatever to rebuild the temple, which is second temple comes at that time. Why it's kind of important is that not all Jews return. For some, life in diaspora was quite good at that time. A couple hundred years passed. So it's many new generations. And they have their own businesses, they have their own life, they have own schools, whatever. So they are already in a very different position. And not everybody comes back. Now, the next empire that colonized that world, and there was a colonial power, if you will, at that time. It was starting from Macedonia, from Alexander, Greek troops, marched down to the area of Holy Land that we call right now. First, they conquered Egypt, and that's a story on its own, how Greek and Egyptians connected their history and religions together. And then he went all the way to Persia, defeated Persians, practically to India. That's when he comes. Now, those black dots, it's a major part of Jewish settlements at that time and Greek Empire. And again, you can see that not all of them returning. Alexandria becomes a huge Jewish city, and that a lot of people stayed in Iraq and Persia at that time. Now, what else here is kind of important, that when Alexander of Macedonia dies, that empire falls into two. Seleucids here on the north, and Ptolemies in Egypt, and they start fighting. And what happens, Jerusalem and Judah and all the territory right in between those two large Greek empires. So life is miserable there. It's always war, there's always problems, and they were trying to fight for their own independence, and that's what time of Maccabees was. Then they fought Seleucids at that time. But nevertheless, it was a dangerous place to live. And so the diaspora persisted and in many places actually flourished. They lived quite well away from that military campaign. And then finally, sort of another empire comes in and takes over, and that's Romans right now. They come in, they take all the Greek culture, but changed it into Latin names and words, and they moved on into Europe much more than into Asia. But nevertheless, they had all the Jewish territories conquered here. And there were several Judeo-Roman wars. They were fighting and they were living in peace. They were fighting again. Jews constantly rebelled against that colonial power because they wanted to have their independent nation. And the last revolt was Bar Kokhba revolt in 135. And when it was defeated, the Hadrian, emperor of Rome at that time, said, that's enough. All Jews must go. And so he kicked everybody out of that territory. So the diaspora not only stayed where it was, but all of this new people, whoever was there in the Holy Land and Canaan, Jerusalem, were kicked out. So the diaspora increased, and that was the diaspora as we basically know it since the end of the Roman Empire. They lived in Italy, went to Europe here, Italy, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Persia. So that's the story of diaspora. We'll stop here on that and move on to genetic things, which is much more exciting, I think, for all of us. So this is the simple family tree. I'm sure most of you have penciled your family trees at home on a napkins, on a piece of paper, anywhere on a computer. So I want you to be, for the sake of our discussion here, Ben Brown. Down here, red-haired little kid, okay? He obviously has his cousins, his sister, his uncles, and whoever in the family. But what I want you to pay attention, one thing which will be important. He has two parents, as every one of us has two parents, okay? Father and mother. And each of these parents obviously has his or her own parents. So that little kid Brown, in the second generation back, an ancestor already has 4 ancestors. Okay, so it doubles every time with every generation. So if we go look at this slide now, this is our Ben Brown. Okay, he had mother and father, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, but as you go back to 6th generation, only 6th generation, which is about 120, 150 years back, he had, or each of us, has 64 ancestors, which is a significant number to know all your 64. And what is also very important here, that if he, on average, gets 50% from father, 50% genetic information from mother, then he gets only 25 from grandparents. And going back from 6th generation, all he gets is 1.5% of their genetic information. It's very little. And 6th generation is not that far back. So that's 2 things to remember. That number of ancestors is always 2 in the power of that generation. Okay, so it's 2 in the 5th generation, 2 in the power of 5, 20th generation, 2 in the power of 20, and so on. So if you look at this one, and you go from David, remember that King David, back to Abraham. So if you were born at the time with King David, so you had 16,000 ancestors. If you go back from forward now, from David to Babylonian exile, it's another 14 generation past. From Babylonian exile to Jesus Christ, another 14 generation. So total of 42 generations. So someone born at the year 1 of new era, of common era, had 4 trillion whatever ancestors going back to Abraham. And you remember on 64 generation, we had only 1.5 genetic information from this guy. For this number, it's infinitely small amount of DNA or genetic information that you have going back. If somebody born today and you want to see how many ancestors you had at the time of Jesus, I don't know what that number is. It's billions of people, and that you have to count as your ancestors. Okay, how's that genetic information transmitted from one to another? Here is a mother, father, and a little daughter that comes in, and all this genetic information is stored in the DNA. See, the DNA that consists of nucleotides, and that's a large number of DNA. So we have to pack it somehow, not we, but somebody had to pack it into nucleus of the cell, because that where it is, it's in the nucleus, 90+% of DNA stored there. 5% of more or less is stored in mitochondria. That will become important in a minute. But the majority, overwhelming majority, it's in the nucleus. Now, in order to store all that DNA, it has to be packed very tightly, and it's packed first into the chromosomes. And the chromosomes, each cell of our body, has 23 pairs of chromosomes, which is total 46 chromosomes. Okay. Now, all of this 44 chromosomes, the 22 pairs, are called autosomes. They're responsible for your height, weight, different diseases, color of your eyes, length of your arms, and so on. how your body works, how your pulmonary, your cardiac system works. 2 chromosomes are responsible for transmitting genetic and gender information. One is X, and that transmits female traits, and the other one is Y. So we have 46 chromosomes, 44 of that they call autosomes, and 2 sex chromosomes in it. Now, in order to transmit this information, so you have to get half of that from mother and half from father. So those chromosomes have to divide, to separate first in the germ cells. And that's exactly what happened. In the within the egg, as egg matures, or within the sperm as that matures, those chromosomes separate. And so we have paternal cells carry only 23 chromosomes, and maternal egg carries 23 chromosomes. And when they unite at the fertilization, now you have back 46 chromosomes. See, it all comes together on that. Now, another concept that I want, that kind of becomes important for all of us, I don't know where to stand so I can not be on the way for people. You tried, I'm sure, to create pedigree of your family. You go back to great parents, great grandparents, and whoever you want to find out. That's fairly easy to do. So let's say this is me, okay? And I created that pedigree. And I know all the way back that I had great grandparents, and one of them was a famous person, whatever. If it doesn't matter, but it doesn't mean, I'm sorry, that I have received genetic material from that person. He is or she is in my pedigree, but I may or may not receive genetic material from that person. And the reason for that, you see, I may receive genetic ancestry from totally different personality. You remember, I have hundreds of those ancestors. So it's not necessarily that I receive all some parts from everybody. And why it happens? It happens because what they call recombinations of chromosomes. When remember I told you 2 chromosomes have to separate in the preparation for creating germ cells, and then they reunite together when the embryo is fertilized. During both this process, what happens is that part of one chromosome can jump into the other chromosome. And the other chromosome donates its part back to the first chromosome. So you have all the same genes, but they're not necessarily all from father. You have a couple or hundreds or whatever from father and from mother. And the opposite is here. So there is a recombination that occurs spontaneously and at random. There is no way of knowing how much from one chromosome is going to go to another chromosome. It's absolutely unknown. Here's another example of that. And there's 2 chromosomes. One, let's say it's paternal, this is maternal, and then they recombine, and you have different combination. Here is kind of even, but it could be very uneven. It could be one chromosome has so much, the other one has nothing. So let's say here is the picture of a sperm. So each sperm may have either chromosome that had no recombination or had some recombination in whatever proportion it happens. And then a second random event that occurs, that's only one male cell will fertilize an egg. And we don't know which one it is. And nobody knows, out of millions, and this one jumps in, and we have no idea how much information from grandparents that particular cell carried forward. That's why in a pedigree, we're coming back here, it's your great-grandfather, for sure. But you may not get any genetic information from that person. You might get it from this guy's. that comes to you. So that's why siblings don't look exactly the same. That's why you may not look like your great-grandparents, but through your great-uncle, you might look. Okay. So genetic information moves forward either through the nuclear DNA, and that's all of that moves forward, or remember I told you some DNA lives in the mitochondria, and that transmits only on maternal side, from mother to daughter, from mother to daughter, from daughter to granddaughter. It does not transmit from son to subsequent generations. It stops on that. Or one can look at Y chromosome, and Y chromosome is only transmitted from father to son, from father to son. Women have nothing to do with Y chromosome. So that information genetically will be transmitted on paternal side, maternal side, or everything could be transmitted together. So how is it what we do when you do the test, or you want to look at your ancestry? You isolate your DNA, you spit into that tube, and send it to the lab. They isolate DNA, and then they sequence that DNA. What means sequence? They figure out what that sequence of adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine is in your chromosome, in your DNA. And they can use that DNA from the entire genetic material, or only from maternal side, or only from paternal side. Okay? You with me? Once they've isolated those nucleotides, then they know, they look and they say, okay, this guy has following sequence, TGTCT, whatever. And I call it that sequence number 1. Now they go to another person, and that person has substitute. Instead of T, here's A in this position, and here's A in this position. So everything is the same except there are 2 A's. So I said number 2 haplotype. And the third person has few more different things. So why that is important is that if they isolated my DNA, let's say I'm in number 3, and then they isolated DNA from somebody else, and that person and I have the same haplotype, which means that we are probably related. And we are probably have the same ancestors. If the second person has haplotype number 1 and I have 3, it's highly unlikely that we are related, and highly unlikely that we are coming from the same ancestral lineage. So that becomes your genetic ID card, your haplotype. And when people isolated haplotype from Y chromosome of people who claimed to have been Cohens. As we know, Cohens, it goes from father to son, father to son. And if somebody claims I am a Cohen, and so they take DNA from these people and they looked at that, and it happens to be that 50% of Ashkenazi Kohanim have the same haplotype by Y chromosome.
Say that again.
50% of people who claim that they are Cohens have similar genetic ID card, haplotype. So it's 50% chance that they are indeed Cohen that came from ancestral Levi's and Moses's, Aaron line at that point. Now, non-Kohanim, however, happens to be 5% people have that haplotype too. So not having it does not exclude you. Having it does not necessarily confirm, but gives you 50% chance that you are in that situation. What's kind of interesting that the same genetic ID by Y chromosome has been found in surrounding people as well. So whether that admixture happened through those generations, who knows? But today, if you look at that, it might be a Kurd, and 20% of them will have similar haplotype to Kohanim. So again, it's very suggestive that you are from the same lineage that you claim, but it's not provable for 100% that you are from there. One more genetic concept that you kind of need to know, and that is natural selection versus genetic drift. That's kind of important. Natural selection, look at that giraffe. You know, by Darwin, that if tree is too tall, so every generation of this animal will have longer and longer and longer neck, and then eventually the strongest will survive. The one with the tallest neck with a high, that's the natural selection. The other one, it's not natural, it's genetic drift. It's, let's say there were a bunch of butterflies, red and yellow, and then wind blew and took only yellow butterflies into surrounding forest or new island or whatever. So now all the butterflies that will start coming from those one that blown away will be only yellow. It's not because they've selected to be there. There's no natural selection. It's just by chance was their genes drifted into that situation. But the same happens with what they call bottleneck effect, which is kind of important for us to in a minute too. Just say there were a bunch of people here with different genes, and they designated by different shapes and colors. And then natural disaster occurred. Something, flood, iceberg fell on them. Crusaders moved through the village and killed everybody, but there 2 or 3 people survived. So again, it's not a natural selection. It might have been the weakest people who remained, because they may have went up to the mountain, collect wood for the fire, and they survived. But all the warriors, the strong guys, got killed on that time. But regardless of that, now the subsequent generation will only have genes from those survivors. So it was a bottleneck effect that has nothing to do with natural selection, but with something else. Okay. Now you know history of diaspora, you know genetics, how it transmits. We move on to amalgamate all this together, gel it into a story that we kind of wanted to present. So on the tip of Arabian Peninsula and on the Horn of Africa, there are 2 countries, Yemen, Ethiopia, that have a sizable Jewish population that we know. So how did they happen to be there? Some people say that at the time of Solomon, King Solomon, remember that unified, largest tradable kingdom, they moved there for business opportunity, for who knows why. But they also moved there because that was called Kingdom of Sheba. You might remember Queen of Sheba, who lived here on both sides of that's an entrance to the Red Sea. And then Queen of Sheba came to learn some wisdom from King Solomon. And she got a lot of wisdom, but she also got pregnant on the way back. So that's part of the wisdom, I guess. But so she comes back and she gives birth to that person, Menelik I, who established the first Ethiopian dynasty that lasted until 1974, with Emperor Haile Selassie was kicked by the communist revolution in Ethiopia and then killed. So the Jews of Ethiopia, or they call themselves Beta Israel, their legend is that they are descendants of Queen Sheba and King Solomon and other Jews who arrived with Queen Sheba back to that territory. Okay, and they arrived to the Ethiopian. There's minimal support for paternal lineage. Y chromosome is almost not identical in all these people with the Jewish population. But maternal DNA, remember we have maternal DNA, paternal, and all together. Maternal DNA suggests clustering with neighborhood population and some relationship with those Jews who came in, suggesting that Jewish men may have married local women. The most likely explanation for large population of Ethiopian Jews is that some men came there and married. Now, Ethiopian Jews accepted by Sephardic chief rabbinate, they're Jews, they don't have to claim anything, but there's another branch there, Falash Mura, those are Ethiopian Jews who converted to Christianity. They think that they've converted because of the forceful conversion, who knows, but they've converted. And so now for them to go back to Judaism, they have to undergo formal conversion. While Ethiopian Jews, Jews who stay Jews, don't need formal conversion. They just show up and say, I'm a Jew, and that's all you need to show. Now, the Jews of Yemen, a little different. They claim, actually, that they were from tribes of Judah, Benjamin, Levi, and Reuben. And their legend goes that they listened to Jeremiah's prediction that first temple will be destroyed. And instead of sitting and waiting, they decided to move south. That's how they claim. And they claim that they went also with Queen Sheba, Solomon's traders, whatever, but not as a descendants of that lineage, but rather just from different tribes that came there. And they were described in the books of Benjamin of Tudela, which is a guy who was 100 years before Marco Polo, traveling around the world and writing about different tribes that he met. Maimonides writing letters to Yemen. So we know from 11th and 12th century that they were there, at least at that time. They don't share any haplotype with the Ethiopian Jews, which is kind of very interesting. They're right next to each other. They don't share any haplotypes for that. The Y chromosome, they're much more similar to Jewish population than an Ethiopian Jews, again suggesting that they probably came on the male side from Mediterranean, and they on maternal DNA traced to 5 Western Asian women, 1 Eastern African women. So they most likely, again, there was men who coming in, married locally, and retaining Jewish faith and remain in Judaism. Let's move a little bit farther south, and then there's a Igbo Jews. I don't know how many of you have heard of them, but there is a substantial group, and some of them in the United States, and they claim to be descendant of God, 7th son of Jacob. They practice circumcision on the 8th day. They keep kosher. They wear talit and kippah. They celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But otherwise, they have a mixture of holidays, Christian, Jewish, and what have you. Right now, they drifted much more towards Judaism. They're trying to abandon whatever Christian services they had. They lived in small, it's actually a large area of Nigeria down here, and they are Jewish people. Another interesting tribe is the Lemba Jews, who they claim that they came via either Ethiopia or through Igbos and then farther south. They live on the border between Rhodesia and South Africa, Zimbabwe and South Africa. And those Lemba Jews, what they do, they observe Shabbat, they do not eat pork, they do practice circumcision, ritual slaughter, using Star of David on their tombstones and what have you, but they have no Torah. All of that is kind of orally transmitted to one another. And they claim, now they also build synagogues. Now everybody wants to be Jewish, everywhere. But so that's and they had the South African Jews generally considered them as a curiosity rather than cousins. But nevertheless, they claim that they are Jewish. And interesting, 50% of them have Semitic Y chromosome. whether we want it or not, but they're very typical, like Cohen chromosomes. This people do have. So genetically, they have enough information to support their claim to be Jewish. Okay, look to many Jews who stayed behind in Babylon, never moved away from Persia. And they stayed there after exile. They wrote Book of Esther that you all know. And they moved farther north and east from where they were as the war continued between Greek and Persians, between Persians and Muslims that were coming in. So they moved away. They moved to Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, and 70% of these people inherited male Y chromosome, which is from common ancestors. So they do have a good claim on the Jewishness of their ancestors. Genetically, they're closer to one another than to Palestinians or Kurds or some other Arabs. Here's the Georgian Jews. For example, Georgia, it's in Russia, in the Caucasus, not Georgia and Atlanta or else. And they moved there. And they have what you remember we talked about founder effect. So there are several families of that Persian Jews moved there, and all their descendants came from those several families. They carried genes very, very similar. And in fact, they could trace their maternal DNA, 51% of them, to one woman. So they all came from one sort of larger family. They have, then there's a mountain Jews that live in Dagestan, have nothing to do with Georgia, different language, different customs, except the Judaism, obviously they have the same. They continued the language, interestingly, Judeo-Persian, which is a mixture of Hebrew and Persian language. That's what they talk. And they have 58% of them tracking to one single woman of that, going back into generations. Farther east we go, we come to Jews from Bukhara. And I'm sure you know there's a large Bukharan community here in Denver. They have their own synagogues, they all have their own communities. And those, they claim that they came from a tribe of Issachar, one of the Jacob's son. And in fact, Issacharov is a very popular name among Bukharan Jews. And they speak Judeo-Persian, which is very similar to Farsi, to Persian language in Iran today. Even though they live not pretty far from Iran, but apparently they moved from Iran through Tajikistan and here to Bukhara, and that's where they live. Again, most of these Jews, have immigrated away from there. They're now either in Israel or English-speaking countries, England, Canada, United States. But traditionally, that's where they came. They all carry their tradition. They have Y chromosome similarities with other Jews, much more than with non-Jewish population. We'll go farther east, and other groups, 3 groups of Jews in India that settled. One group in the area of Mumbai, and it's called Bnei Israel. Another group in Cochin in the southern India, and a third group in Calcutta, mainly. Let's kind of look at each of them. So Bnei Israel and Cochin, it's more genetic similarity with Jews, but a huge number of admixture of local people. So again, over the centuries that they've been there, it's probably 20, 30 generation at least that there were Jewish men marrying local women, converting to Judaism. And that's why they kept their religion, but genetically they dissolved into the many other tribes that they were there. Cochin Jews, kind of interesting, they claim that they came as traders from Solomon time and settled on a very southern tip of India. They still have old synagogues there, which is fascinating. And they claim they've arrived at first or second temple, but documented presence of them only comes from 9th century, from year 1000 of common air. And then they have also Jewish, non-Jewish ancestor, very different genetically from these guys. Because they're many generations apart and
But their synagogues, we were there.
yes,
Your synagogues are like,
yeah,
can't find any place.
yeah. No, we went to the same synagogue probably in Cochin, you know, it's fascinating small place, but that's what it is. And a third group, it's in Calcutta, they call themselves Baghdadi Jews. Those Jews came in 19th century, 18th century from Baghdad, Aleppo, from Ottoman Empire, when they, you know, Sassoon family, Kaduri family, all those very wealthy families that showed up. They have absolutely nothing to do with these guys. They were kind of local tribes that they didn't want to even associate with them, but they were coming from that. The final group here that I want to share with you is the Chinese Jews that were living in Kaifeng. It's kind of a start of the track that Marco Polo did, and then Silk Road that started from there, bringing goods through India to Europe. They practically non-existent today. There are some who claim heritage, no genetic confirmation of that, but they claim heritage, they convert, they have to convert in traditional way to Judaism in order to be considered Jews. As I showed you, Jewish people during Roman Empire also settled along Mediterranean Sea, both north and south. But here, let's look at the south part of it. There were a lot of Jewish communities in Egypt and Alexandria. There was a very strong Jewish community in Libya and Tunisia and Morocco, those along the Mediterranean Sea. And then in Libya, there's Cyrenaica region, which was huge Jewish community in Ptolemaic time and the Ptolemaic Empire. And Tunisia, people go as a tourist to Isle of Jerba that has first temple synagogues of that time, although it's been destroyed and then rebuilt, but then rebuilt in probably only 4th century. It's a very, very old synagogue in Tunisia. In Morocco, from Solomon time, also merchants moved there along Mediterranean Sea. And the Berbers, that's now Berbers are all Muslim tribes, but at that time they converted into Judaism before Islam. And they actually used Jewish inscription on their tombstones. So if you go through Berber towns in Morocco, you find their Jewish sort of ancestry, but then they converted to Islam and then they stayed under Islam altogether. Y chromosome of Middle Eastern in those people all along the Mediterranean shores, similar among other Jewish groups, and they have 40% admixture of either Eastern, Middle Eastern or European. Because they were on the time of the Roman Empire, they were mixing, and that's the admixture is pretty significant of European. The Sephardic Jews, that's one of the 2 largest groups that remain, that's Sephardic and Ashkenazi. And you can see how they, when they were kicked from Spain, expelled, actually second time, first time they were expelled in about 700 Common Era by when Visigoths took on Christianity, they expelled them. So they went back to Morocco, united with Berbers, and took over Spain and waited for 500 years or 600 years until Ferdinand and Isabella expelled them second time from there. Once they got expelled, they resettled. They resettled back in the Middle East into Turkey, Greece. A lot of them went to Italy. Substantial number went to Amsterdam and Northern Europe and England as well. Yeah, so that's Sephardic Jews. What they did, there's no dispute that they're Jewish genetically, that's to say, but they brought their Sephardic liturgy, Sephardic customs on all over the world, that there's people, even Jews who never been to Spain, or what they call them Mizrahi Jews, they have all the Sephardic liturgy and Sephardic way of customs and food and everything else. Now, Sephardic Jews, the Y chromosome is 65% typical Middle Eastern chromosome. So they are Jewish, Middle Eastern. They have interesting fact that in Spain, close to 12–15% of people have Jewish ancestry. Because there are a lot of Spanish people who, Jews who converted and stayed in Spain, and then they propagated their genetic. None in Basque country, zero. Those guys are totally from different region. Many Ashkenazi and Sephardic genes from Italy and Spain. They've mixed together. And in fact, a lot of people who are doing Ancestry or 23andMe, they find substantial admixture of Italian blood or Spanish blood. And that's where it's coming from. It's not that your grandmother did something recently. Now, the final group, it's Ashkenazi Jews. The land of Ashkenaz originally was behind Mount Ararat in Armenia, and Armenians have historian named Ashkenazi nation. Ashkenaz, it's a very famous Armenian name, but somehow they moved from that territory behind Mount Ararat to Europe, to Germany, and that's where we know Ashkenazi Jews are coming from. So I just want to show you that map. There were a lot of Jewish communities in Europe. A lot of them were killed and eradicated by crusaders as they passed through. At one point, there was such a bottleneck, I'll show to you in a minute, that were claimed that only 350 Ashkenazi Jews were remaining in Europe. There were all others killed by that. But here, I want you to kind of concentrate this little town in Germany, Erfurt, and now it's kind of a small town, very contemporary with medieval structures. But there was a Jewish cemetery, and also during excavation to build new homes near that cemetery, they found skeletons. The workers found skeletons. You cannot, by Jewish law, cannot extract DNA from skeletons, cannot disturb it. So what they did, they found about 32 teeth that fell out of those skeletons. And then you can use that for biochemical analysis and what have you. And so they found those teeth, examined them, and from this 33 skeletal remains that were dated to 14th century. Historically, it's exactly time when they were killed and kicked out of Germany, these people. Genetically, they're very similar to today's Ashkenazi Jews. So we say, yes, this is very typical Ashkenazi Jews. But they had substantial admixture of Southern, mainly Italian ancestry, and some Eastern European ancestry. So that's Italian, finding Italian DNA in Ashkenazi Jews, it's normal, so to speak. And 33% had specific Ashkenazi maternal haplotype and no admixture beyond 14th century. So whatever Ashkenazi Jews had at 14th century, that's it, that stayed. And that was depicted here, is depicted here. That's the time and generations ago. So if you go back to 25 to 30 generations back from us today, there was a bottleneck in Europe in which our DNA compressed substantially and then opened up again. So that's why when you get Ashkenazi Jewish DNA, it's kind of easy to determine because we're all very, very similar today because they were so substantial bottleneck. Going farther back for one final slide, that studies of DNA of Iranian, Iraqi, Syrian, Italian, Turkish, Ashkenazi Jews showed that you can roughly separate all those Jews into two categories. One is Iranian and Iraqi Jews, those Jews who stayed behind in Babylon and never actually moved anywhere, and the Jews who moved through Syria, Turkey, Italy, towards Europe and north into Europe. And that split occurred probably 100 to 150 generations back. Not years, but generations back, when there's two waves that went aside. And that approximately historically corresponds to years of Babylonian Empire, Persian Empire. That's when that we have kind of separated from these guys. So are we all cousins? You know, eventually we all have in Ashkenazi, they have 30 to 60% of a mixture of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, very, very similar. 50% of Ashkenazi Jews have Y chromosome haplotype, which is a Middle Eastern origin. So we could say, not for sure, but with a great degree of sort of certainty, that we do belong to Middle Eastern ancient Hebrews at that time. And now I want to thank you for your attention, and you can clap and ask me a difficult question. Thank you very much. I'll answer any
If you
question.
wanna-
Oh, I want to
If you
stop
want,
sharing.
So, Boris, yeah, very fascinating stuff. Now, you didn't mention Afghanistan and the Pashtun. I remember many, many years ago, could be 15 years ago, I think even Time magazine wrote an article suggesting that the Pashtun might have been descend or have Jewish origins.
You're absolutely correct, but the way I approach that is whoever claims to be Jewish today, are they all related? Pashtun, even if they had that origin, which I don't know, but they moved away. They're totally Muslims for generations now. They have nothing to do with Judaism. So I can't answer this question. Although there were suggestions, you're absolutely right.
And also, you look, I did this ancestry thing with my genetics. I sort of hoped that I had more Sephardic genes than I actually turned out to have. But I keep getting information from them to say that there's somebody who's like a second or third cousin, and they talk about what seems to be a minute amount of genetic material. How should I understand that?
First of all those genetic companies that they do testing, the answer they provide much more important for current cousinship than actual ancestry, because they could not go beyond 4 or 5 generations back. It's just almost impossible to prove what you have. If you have enough similarities, like 3%, 4%, that will tell you it's your 4th cousin, it's very possible that that person is, because if you go 4 generations back, then you remember you'll have 30, almost 30 ancestors at that time. So you don't know who out of 30 ancestors, which wave was on the right hand side or the left side. And they would not know. The genealogical tree is different from your genetic information. You have to take that information and go and say, possibly we're related, but you may never find how you actually were related to that person. The names are different, the places of origin passed around. But the way this company works, they create their own database. They collect DNA from, let's say, 50 people here in the audience, and they say all these 50 people claim that they are Italians. So now we have Italian pattern. And so then they get DNA from somebody else, and it's very similar to this 50. They say, yeah, it's mostly Italian. Ashkenazi Jews, it's good up to as I showed to you, probably Middle Ages or early Renaissance period. Beyond that, we don't know whether they came from. Helen, yeah, and then.
I also,
Okay,
Did
that's
you-
fine, that's fine. Go ahead
Okay.
and then we'll move to.
okay, I also had my DNA done by Ancestry.com, and it says that I'm 98% Eastern European Jewish and 2% Baltic, which didn't surprise me at all. What has surprised me is I will get matches, individuals, and I will look at shared matches. And so, I'm related to individual X. And some of the shared matches are people that I know personally on my mother's side, and others I know personally on my father's side. So it appears that this individual X is related to me on both sides, and yet my mother's family and father's family, while they were both from the Russian Empire, were from very different parts. It's highly unlikely that they ever encountered each other in the old country. How do you explain that?
Oh, because you have certain amount of DNA that comes from both sides.
Mhm.
So that's why that relations on ancestry.com shows that you have, let's say, third cousin or fourth cousin on your father's side, which has nothing to do with your maternal side.
Mhm.
And that there will be a totally separate way of looking at your mother. They don't know it. That the way that you have two sides doesn't mean that these sides were together at some point. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm sure they weren't.
Yeah, they were not.
Mhm.
They were not. There was a Goldberg family on this side and whatever it is, and there was something totally different on the other side. And you happen to have a little bit of DNA from both sides. So you have some cousins on one and some cousins on the other.
And some that Ancestry.com says I'm related on both sides.
Correct. Oh, you related to both?
Yeah.
No, they won't say that.
Yeah, I have where my shared matches. I'll look at a shared match and I'll say, oh yeah, this person is on my mother's side. I know this person, and another, and the second shared match for the same person is on my father's side. It's like, yeah, I know this person.
And that's
He's
a
on-
possibility that there were cousins, because cousins could marry.
Mhm.
Jewish
Yeah,
law.
but I mean, they were so far away from each other.
Well, things happen.
Things happen.
I don't know. That's right. We're all cousins.
Boris, I think this is a very, very interesting presentation. And I think you're to be commended for pulling all of this together, both from the genetic side and from the historical side. My question is whether or not there is also a very strong social component here that made it possible for this tiny, tiny amount of DNA that gets transmitted to be continuous and represented in people who claim to be Jewish. In other words, was there something socially that took this tiny, tiny component of DNA and allowed them to possibly at one time merge with a local person, but subsequently to remain with other groups considered to be
Correct.
Jewish?
You're absolutely right. And there were different times in periods in history where marrying outside of Judaism was allowed, and there were times that it was prohibited. And so for example, when people came back from Babylonian exile, Ezra and Nehemiah issued edict prohibiting marrying non-Jewish women, or Jewish women marrying non-Jewish men. But before that, in Babylonian exile and diaspora, it was fairly common to happen. And then it stopped. Then the other thing, all these merchants and people in business that moved totally different areas, and they had sons, they had brothers, they had young people who stayed there. They married local women, because usually women didn't migrate on that, and who converted to Judaism.
But they, but they must also have married Jewish women.
Oh, yes,
And with enough frequency that that tiny bit of DNA was preserved
Oh,
over
absolutely.
many, many generations.
yes,
And
yes,
that seems to be fairly unique.
yes. It is fairly unique, but you know, the Jewish groups also fairly strict, not only in marrying outside of the faith, but sometimes in a different group. You know, there were times that Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews would not mix, but there were times that they would. You know, and there's a lot of Sephardic Jews who moved into Italy and then went up north toward Germany. They did mix with Ashkenazi Jews, but in Jerusalem they won't do it. There was no. But, yeah, go ahead and we'll come back.
I have a variation, I think, of the question, are we all cousins? And the question is, are we all Jews? Does DNA address that issue? We talk about the Jewish people, and when I hear all the locations and history of all the different Jews around the world, who's in and who's out? And is DNA relevant to that question of determining if I'm a Jew? Can I take a DNA test and it'll show whether I'm a Jew or not?
Correct. Very, very good question. And for many people, it's totally irrelevant. Whoever converted to the Jewish person, even by halacha, is someone who is born to Jewish mother or who traditionally converted to Judaism. So if you converted and you became a Jew, you're a Jew. If you want to call yourself a Jew in more liberal way and more reform synagogue or reform crowd, it's up to you. Whether other Jews will consider you Jew, I don't know. But that's a very good question. Actually, I go in the introduction in my book about this. Who is actually the Jew and whether it's important or not important? That's in the eyes
But
of
does
the
DNA at all inform that question? Is it at all relevant?
It depends for what is relevant. That's what is relevant to you, because what's relevant to you may not be relevant to me. You know, it's how you want to consider that. You know, for many people, anyone who calls himself a Jew is a Jew, but for others, it's not. Whether it's right, wrong, I don't know, but that's what it is. Hold on the stand and then Martha.
You know, I may have misunderstood, but I thought you said that in Morocco, the Jews kind of left the area. And I remember we were sitting in a restaurant in Morocco and it was Shabbat and we saw the people carrying Torahs down the street, which startled us a great deal. I think there were a lot of Jews in Morocco.
Oh, yeah. Most Jews have left Morocco, but there are some are. We went there, went through several synagogues, and there were very few Jews. But then there were, with better relations with Israel, there's more tourists are coming right now. The Jews of Moroccan origin from France, from other countries coming there. It's kind of waving too. It's not all the same, but the Jews of Morocco have a tremendous history of being Jews in Morocco.
An unrelated Jewish question.
Yes.
They say that redheads will disappear from the world. What is the genetic background?
Cannot answer to you, but I don't think they will disappear. Martha wanted to ask. Behind you. Jews.
I'll stand up, it's easier. Thanks to Boris for his book, just so you know, he has a book and it's on Amazon, but you saw the cover up. So in your book, you mentioned about a little bit more about Mizrahi Jews. And I'm fascinated about that because I have a friend from many years ago who thought she was Catholic and lived in Venezuela. And her last name was Osuna. And she went to Spain. She had some kind of a medallion and went to the priest Osuna, and he said, "No, you're Jewish." And so she got big into Judaism, and she has Jewish family in Canada. And when when you talk about Spain and Sephardic Jews, and then talk about Mizrahi Jews, she gets all bent out of shape because she's sure she's Mizrahi and not from Spain. And so you touched on that, but I'm still a little confused about the difference between the two.
Okay, I'll try. Not that I will give you precise answer to that. The Mizrahi Jews traditionally are Jews who did not go to Spain, who stayed behind in whatever area. It was the area around Jerusalem, there was area farther to Iraq, whatever. That's the Mizrahi Jews. The Sephardic, by the virtue of a name, Sephardic, is that they've been to Spain. Sfarad, it's the Spain in Hebrew. So when Sephardic Jews were expelled from Spain and they came back to Middle East and further, they brought with them all their traditions and liturgy and way of cooking, way of eating, way of praying, and Mizrahi Jews accepted them. So there is a lot of not pollination, but cross-cultural acceptance of both sides. And obviously they probably remarried, married each other as well. So where she is originally, her family from, I don't know, and she probably doesn't know. But then somehow that Spanish influence on her family was significant enough that in Spain they told her that she's Sephardic Jew, that she went to Venezuela, and which is more likely for Sephardic Jews than Mizrahi Jews. But so there is a cross weaving of Mizrahi Jews and Sephardic, but the original traditional name Sephardic are those who came from Spain into back in Mizrach or went to England, Netherlands, whatever countries then there might have been. Chuck.
Not sure I'm gonna be able to ask this question correctly.
Ah.
But when you do this research and you find 50% or 30% hits, so that you can say there are Jewish aspects to various people, isn't it the other 50%?
Correct.
Isn't it true you could do the same book about are all the Christians cousins, or are all the Irish cousins, or are they all our cousins? Because that 50% that doesn't hit, or that intermarriage that you described, or well, you didn't call it that, but that intermarriage also means that we're all cousins with everybody. No?
No, not, yeah, I know what you're saying, but but it's not. The ethnicity and of different European Christians could be traced differently by their genetic haplotype. They're not, the Northern Europeans differ from Southern Europeans. So among Northern Europeans, yes, they may be cousins. And then the Vikings occupied the British Island and Irish and what have you. There is a lot of admixture as well. But the genetic going back to ancestry does not establish 100% one way or another. It just likelihood, as in your business is more likely than not, you know, that it would be possible or would be plausible or what have you. So that's what happens with the genetics going back that far back. With the genetics going back just few generations, it's much easier to identify it. It's all Irish, all Italians.
What I mean is,
And Christianity is such a wide.
but what I mean is, with regard to the all of us cousins, all of the cousins
Yes.
you would identify using this genetic approach,
I-
the admixture that also is part of the same people,
Correct.
goes in a way somewhere else. And so you could say that all those who claim to be Jews because they have these similarities also could just as easily claim to be part of the admixture that happened.
It could be, but it's because we carry that through generations of Jewish traditions. So it's more likely than not that they are related. Whether or not they're related to other people, very possible too.
That's all. That's all.
Yeah. No, you're right. There is no definitive answer on that. Because it's not going beyond 40 to 50% chance.
But the admixture is not the same. I think that's- Yeah, I know.
Yes, admixture is, in some cases, yes, and some may not be. You know, if you take people from France or Switzerland where they have Italian, yeah, and may not.
But the relatedness to the ancient Hebrews, in the second part of the question.
Yes, that it's a likely that they are related to them. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, guys. Thank you.